They say beauty's in the eye of the beholder. It's an adage Katie Wilson was all too familiar with.
I was a pretty big nerd back in high school, and I didn't really go on a lot of dates. I was overweight, not that cute.
So in the fall of 1994, the Salt Lake City High School senior was pleasantly surprised when a handsome classmate began paying attention to her. His name was Thad Roberts.
He was pretty physically fit. He was intense, energetic.
Katie agreed to go out with Thad, and on their first date, she quickly realized the two had a lot in common.
We were both members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which a lot of people refer to as the Mormon religion. He was the older child in his family, and I was the younger child, and so neither of us really got a lot of attention in our families. Both of us growing up were nerds.
The two teens bonded quickly, and before long, Katie and Thad were over the moon for each other.
Katie was head over heels for Thad. He's really good at, you're beautiful, I love you, you're wonderful. She fell madly in love with him.
After just 4 months of dating, Katie and Thad knew they were destined for the altar. But before they could say their I do's, there was just one holdup. In the summer of 1996, soon after starting college, Thad left for a 2-year missionary trip.
It was so hard. We both cried so much before he went on his mission. Because even though you know you're going to wait for each other, you don't get to spend time together. All you can really do is write letters to each other.
After Thad's departure, Katie tore open the letter he left behind, fully expecting a heartfelt goodbye. But instead, she got a crushing confession.
So when I opened up the letter, inside there it had said that there was a girl in his English class in college that he had actually tried to ask her on a date, and it broke my heart.
Katie was devastated, and she wondered why Thad had chosen to confess in a letter.
He had called me on the phone when he landed from the airport, and I was just crying, and he just didn't understand why I was hurt. He told me that he didn't want to have any secrets in our relationship. He wanted to just get everything out in the open. I felt better after I got off the phone. I felt relieved that, at least he wanted to be honest with me.
As soon as Thad returned home, he did what Katie had hoped he would do. He asked her to be his wife. That August, the happy couple tied the knot in a church ceremony with God, family, and friends as their witnesses.
I felt like a princess, and I was so excited because I was with my prince, and we were going to go off and start our lives together. I was really happy.
The newlyweds were glowing, but just 6 years later, their starry romance would go down in flames. In July of 2002, Thad was doing an internship in Houston, Texas, while Katie kept the home fires burning in Utah. The distance between them had been taking its toll on the couple.
It was really hard when he'd go do internships. Just being apart for so long, I was really concerned about our relationship.
On July 22, 2002, Katie answered a phone call from Thad, fully expecting to talk about their marriage. But instead, Thad had an explosive announcement.
He told me that he was calling me from prison. I was just in shock. Why is he in prison?
In the summer of 1996, Katie Wilson was certain she and her husband Thad Roberts had the right stuff.
Our first few years of marriage, we had a lot of fun. We did everything together. I worked full-time and he went to school.
By now, Thad had decided to focus on science and pursue a triple major in geophysics, physics, and geology.
I'd go on his geology field trips with him, and I started really getting interested in rocks, and so we started our own collection.
The young couple's new rock collection was growing as steadily as their relationship. And frequently, Thad would add new, notable items to their shelves.
Thad was a volunteer up at the museum, and he would bring home specimens from the museum and say that the professors, that they liked him so much that they would just give him specimens that we could add to our collection.
Katie was proud of her brilliant husband, but at times she couldn't help but feel inadequate in Thad's shadow.
Katie looked to Thad for approval a lot of the time, whether it was her looks, whether it was her hanging out with other people.
I think Thad knew that I was really insecure about myself. He always did tell me, I wish you could lose weight. I want you to dress differently. It hurt and it made me want to try to be a different person. But at the same time, I was in love with him.
Katie was a very loyal wife. I mean, Katie did anything that Thad told her.
In May of 2000, Thad's future seemed to shine even brighter when he landed a NASA internship for aspiring astronauts.
So the internship was in Houston, Texas. He would go do it one semester every year, and they had to do 4 of them. I was excited for Thad because he was reaching his goals. He wanted to be one of the first astronauts to go to Mars, and I knew he was smart enough to do it.
That September, Thad set off for Texas, while Katie stayed behind in Utah. She was thrilled for her husband, but she hated being separated from him.
I was a wreck. I cried all of the time.
Still, Katie was pleased when Thad's first semester went smoothly. But when he returned from his second, Thad had some devastating news.
So we went for a little walk. He looked at me and he says, well, I met another woman, and I'm in love with her.
The other woman was an intern at NASA.
I mean, that broke my heart. I was shattered inside. And so he started to just say, well, there is still a chance of us being together, but there are some things that you need to change if you want to get me back. And he started telling me that I needed to lose weight and that I needed to find my own hobbies. I needed to go to school. So, not only is he telling me that, hey, I cheated on you, I'm in love with somebody else, here's a whole list of things that you need to change if you ever want to be with me again.
He just was so controlling that I felt this was another way for Thad to control Katie, to say, see, look, I can leave you fast.
Thad moved out of their apartment and left Katie no choice but to agree to a separation.
We were free to date other people, and he went and lived up at the physics department up at school.
With her self-esteem completely shot and her marriage on the rocks, Katie decided it was time to make some changes.
After we were separated, I started to go ahead and take classes up at the college, and I started exercising. I found a gym to go to, and I started making some friends, and I started finding myself.
Before long, Thad realized he'd made a terrible mistake.
We had been separated for about a month, maybe 2, and I walked in the house and Thad was in my house. I was wondering why and what was going on, and then I walked into the bedroom and I saw the flowers all over and I saw the candles lit. He said he missed me and loved me, that he didn't need to be with the other girl. Of course I was going to take him back. I mean, he's my husband, I love him, and I didn't want to be with anybody else. I did tell him, I said, you hurt me really, really bad. I said, I am still in a lot of pain, but just to know that if you cheat on me again, then we will get divorced.
Katie was glad to have her marriage back on track. She could never have known that Thad's affair was the most innocuous of his secrets.
And he said, the FBI caught me and I'm in jail now.
They basically ruined their lives forever.
By the spring of 2002, Katie Wilson was sure her marriage to Thad Roberts was on the mend. And when she sent him off for his 3rd tour at NASA, Katie was in good spirits.
The 3rd time he went to Houston, things were really good. We were happy. He seemed excited for me to go down and visit him.
That April, Katie boarded a plane to Houston. Once there, Thad showed her around the NASA facilities.
Not very many people get to go to NASA and go in the shuttle simulator and train where the astronauts train. It was really cool.
Thad also introduced Katie to his mentor, Dr. Everett Gibson, a renowned NASA scientist who invited the couple to his lab. There, he showed them something that clearly made an impression on Thad.
We went into a lab, and there were moon rocks in there, and there were little slices that you could put under the microscope. When Thad was looking at the moon rocks, he was so excited it was like a kid in a candy store.
Touching a piece of the moon seemed to have an effect on Thad's ever-active imagination.
Thad just looked at me and he says, wouldn't it be cool if we could steal one of these and sell it? We could make a lot of money. I'm like, yeah.
Following their visit, Katie and Thad's relationship seemed stronger than ever. So later that month, when Thad returned home from his third tour and started acting withdrawn and secretive again, Katie was beyond frustrated.
He would come home pretty late at times without telling me where he was. And I had dinner ready on the table, and I was upset because I was just sitting there waiting, and he didn't come home.
Thad would always give an excuse about staying out late. I was stargazing at the university. I was putting together a club. I was studying.
Thad also told Katie he'd been spending a lot of time with a new university friend, a guy named Gordon McWhorter.
Thad did tell me that Gordon had had kind of a shaky past. He had been arrested previously, and he was just trying to help him out a little bit. They would study together and hang out quite a bit together, but he never really gave me a lot of details.
Katie wanted to believe her husband, but in the summer of 2002, when she dropped him off for his fourth and final tour at NASA, she had a sinking feeling that Thad wasn't to be trusted.
On our drive to NASA, I told him, I said, I just feel like you're going to cheat on me again. He did tell me that he did love me, but I still felt a little gut feeling inside of me just telling me that something was going to happen.
And 3 weeks later, Katie realized she was right.
So over 4th of July weekend, I was planning a trip to go out and visit him in Houston, and I kept trying to call him to get a hold of him before I came down.
And one evening, when Katie called Thad's house and got his roommate instead, she finally heard the heartbreaking truth.
They said, Katie, he's not here. He's not living here. I said, what do you mean he's not living here? They said, he's moved in with another woman. They told me that her name was Tiffany, and she was an intern at NASA. I was shocked. I was hurt. He promised me he would never do it again. He said he wanted to be with me, and now he's living with another woman.
And I remember Katie telling me that I'm done, I'm finally done, and I'm taking off my ring this time, and I'm going to file for divorce.
Katie immediately hopped on a plane to Houston to confront Thad in person and break it off with him for good.
So I flew down over July 4th weekend, and he told me that he loved me, he wanted to be with me, that I didn't understand his relationship with Tiffany. He was using her for something. And I told him, I says, well, I gave you an ultimatum the first time you cheated on me. And when you get back home, we're going to get divorced.
But when Katie returned home, Thad bombarded her with phone calls, declaring his love and begging her to reconsider.
Thad would call her and call her and call her and call her, just always trying to persuade her because he could tell that she had changed. She felt like he was almost stalking her.
I didn't want to take him back because I should have learned the first time, once a cheater, always a cheater.
But before Katie could start divorce proceedings, she received a phone call that completely blew her away.
On July 22nd, I received a collect call on the phone. It was a Sunday, and I was just at my home, and it said from Thad. And that didn't really make sense, but I accepted the charges anyways. And on the phone, he told me that he was calling me from prison. And I said, what are you doing in prison? And he said, well, I stole moon rocks from NASA, and I tried to sell them, and the FBI caught me. And I said, you did what?
Thad had attempted to pull off the most outrageous heist in NASA history.
His ultimate goal was to make a lot of money. The samples that Thad stole were samples from every Apollo mission that landed on the moon.
In the summer of 2002, Katie Wilson's life resembled a bizarre space-age thriller. Her husband, Thad Roberts, had been arrested for stealing moon rocks from NASA.
That's not a phone call you would ever think you were going to get. And then I just started thinking about what's going to happen tomorrow. This is going to be all over the news. What is my life going to be like tomorrow?
As the story of Thad's ill-conceived caper came to light, Katie couldn't believe her husband's gall. It seemed Thad had come up with the idea to steal moon rocks after seeing the collection at his mentor Everett Gibson's NASA office.
Thad Roberts felt like he could acquire some moon rock specimens, and he asked his friend Gordon McWhorter, a student friend of his from the University of Utah, if he could put out some feelers on the internet and see if he could find a potential buyer for these moon rocks.
Thad and Gordon cooked up an online alias, Orb Robinson, which they used to correspond with a number of potential buyers. One of the people they contacted was a Belgian mineral collector named Axel Emmerman.
Axel Emmerman must have known that the sale of moon rocks would be illegal.
Emmerman tipped off the FBI, and the Bureau set up an undercover operation.
We directed Axel to send a few emails expressing interest and to say that he was not able to travel to the United States to facilitate this sale. However, he had a brother and a sister-in-law in the United States.
FBI Special Agent Nick Nance took on the role of the sister-in-law.
My undercover name was Lynn Briley. I took over the email correspondence between Thad and Axel Emmerman's sister-in-law, which was, in effect, me.
Thinking he had a buyer, Thad enlisted 2 female interns to help him pull off the heist. One of his accomplices was his girlfriend, Tiffany Fowler.
Thad broke into Building 31 at Johnson Space Center, broke into Dr. Gibson's office, and then took out a 600 and some odd pound safe, loaded it into a Jeep Cherokee, and then took it to a hotel. They had to resort to wheeling out the safe because Thad was unable to open the safe by the combination.
A few days later, Thad and Tiffany drove their loot to Orlando, where they thought they were meeting Gordon and the prospective buyers. But instead of walking away with a big bag of money, on July 20th, 2002, Thad and his accomplices were taken away in handcuffs.
We arrested them in the parking lot of that hotel. What we found in the hotel room was a tackle box which contained all of the moon rocks that they had taken from Dr. Gibson's laboratory, along with some Martian meteorites that were also in the safe that they had stolen.
Federal authorities estimated that while priceless because of their research potential, the moon rocks were worth a staggering $21 million. But that wasn't all. Thad Roberts had been up to much, much more.
Well, subsequent to Thad's arrest, he and Katie's home was searched, and we found dinosaur bones and some other fossils that he had stolen from the Utah Museum of Natural History, where he had previously worked.
The authorities immediately confiscated the stolen relics and returned them to their rightful owners. Meanwhile, Katie was stunned to learn the extent of her husband's deception.
So he told me that he had received a lot of those fossils and rocks from the museum that the professors had given him because they liked him so much, when it turns out that those were pieces he actually had stole.
In December of 2002, Thad Roberts pleaded guilty to the charge of theft of U.S. government property. And in October of the following year, he was sentenced to 100 months in prison. Even from his prison cell, Thad still tried to find a way to stay in Katie's life.
When he was in prison, he refused to sign my divorce papers. He kept sending me letters telling me how much he loved me. I think he wrote me a letter almost every day, and he would just send them to me in bulk.
After 4 months of stalling, Thad sent the one piece of mail Katie did want to receive from him, and their divorce was finalized in November of 2002. With Thad and his unfortunate space odyssey firmly behind her, the now confident Katie embraces the joys and challenges of her new life.
Katie learned from that relationship that she can be a strong, independent woman, and she can do what she wants.
And today, Katie is once again over the moon, a happily married mother of a 4-year-old girl.
My life now is definitely more fulfilling. I'm happier. I'm healthier than I've ever been. I have a faith that totally fulfills me. My husband now, James, I met him at the gym. So I actually have Thad to thank for that. Because had he not said the things to me that he said or pushed me in the directions that he pushed me into, I never would have tried to better myself.
They say there are plenty of fish in the sea, but Andy Nash always seemed to come up empty-handed.
I was 34. I had had a series of relationships. I was engaged twice, but nothing had really stuck. Nothing seemed to work out.
So by June of 2008, the Minneapolis local decided she was done fishing in shallow waters.
I think Andy was looking for a life mate, someone she could be in a long-term relationship with.
And one day that month, Andy got her first bite.
A friend of mine who was doing some online dating came across a profile that she thought I'd like.
Andy joined the website and soon found herself browsing the profile named Loving a Full Life.
His name is Simon Reed. There was a picture of him with a dog, and he was handsome, and I believe it said he was looking for a serious relationship.
Ready to test the waters, Andy sent Simon a brief message, and just days later, she got a response that had her grinning from ear to ear.
He just sent me a quick, friendly email saying, I'd love to get together for tea or something sometime. We ended up arranging to meet, and we actually met at a pub. I felt like for a first date, there was a lot of chemistry.
The attraction seemed mutual, as Simon opened up about events from his past.
He had been married before in England, and he said he had been in the States about 7 years.
Simon told Andy that he owned part of a construction company. He was very charming, very friendly, outgoing, very easy to get along with.
Simon seemed like a great catch. And as the following week went by, Simon and Andy began making plans for a second date. When suddenly Simon called with shocking news.
A drunk driver had apparently plowed through his fence and hit the front of his house. He was pretty frustrated about all the damages and the construction work they'd have to do. In the meantime, he was going to be staying with a friend of his.
Even without a roof over his head, Simon continued to court Andy. Just days later, he took her on a romantic picnic.
When we got in his truck at the beginning of the second date, he handed me a letter. In the letter, Simon said that he hadn't felt a connection like this with anyone in a long time. And the letter closed with, I know it's a bit early and, we don't know each other that well, but I really feel like I'm falling in love with you. I was starting to fall for him in a big way as well.
For Andy, this was the whirlwind romance she'd been waiting for. But Simon would prove to be slippery when wet, and he would disappear from her life just as swiftly as he had entered it. 2 months later, in August of 2008, Andy Nash was beside herself with worry. She had been expecting Simon for dinner that night, but he was nowhere to be found.
I had spent the night texting Simon, and the next day, I woke up, looked at my phone, no messages.
One day passed, and then another, with no word from Simon. He had disappeared for a day or two before, but to Andy, something about this time felt strangely different.
I had a feeling in the pit of my stomach that something horrible happened to him. He could be dead, he could be injured.
As the days passed, Andy had no idea if she would ever see her boyfriend again. Little did she know that fate was about to bring Simon back in the most unexpected way.
Nobody really had any idea what was going on.
I would have never thought something like this would happen to someone that I know.
In June of 2008, 2 months before Andy Nash's boyfriend Simon Reed went missing, her relationship with the handsome Englishman was in full swing.
The relationship with Simon was progressing really fast. He was right there with me, and he was always saying, how happy he was and how excited he was to have met me.
Simon seemed nothing short of perfect, and Andy delighted in showing him off to her close friends.
I thought he was completely charming, very outgoing, just an all-around, genuine, nice guy.
Andy looked forward to a summer of love. And as the 4th of July weekend approached, Andy and Simon made plans to see the fireworks. But that evening, when Simon didn't show up, Andy became concerned.
Andy was worried, and she was kind of upset. She was afraid something happened to him because it was so out of character for him not to call.
I didn't hear from Simon until the next day. He called me, apologized profusely, and said that he actually had had an accident at the work site. He had fallen from the roof of a building he was working on, and he had to go to the emergency room.
Although initially upset, Andy felt her anger melt away as Simon pleaded for her forgiveness.
I felt bad for him. I was like, I'm sorry I was so angry about it. I'm sorry that I overreacted.
And if Simon felt the need to apologize further, he let his wallet do the talking.
One day, Simon showed up at my apartment and said, you know, I would like to take you shopping today. When all was said and done, he ended up spending $500.
As the hours turned into days, the charming boyfriend Andy had fallen for seemed to be back. But Simon wasn't done wowing Andy just yet. At dinner one night, he made a romantic confession.
Simon looked at me and said, you won't be my girlfriend forever. I am the marrying kind. And that was pretty much what I wanted to hear from him.
Andy thought she had finally hooked her perfect mate.
The relationship definitely was a whirlwind romance. I really felt like I was falling for him in a very short amount of time.
But just when everything seemed too good to be true, Simon's bad luck would strike once again.
Simon called me one day. He was frantic. His dog had just been hit by a car, and he was rushing his dog to the vet, just called me so I would know what was going on.
A dog lover herself, Andy understood Simon's heartache.
They were doing surgery on him, trying to save him. So it was pretty tense. I was pretty worried, and he was, texting me throughout the night.
Simon promised to check back in throughout the day. But as the hours rolled past, Andy received no further word from her man.
I texted him, just please get in touch, let me know what's happening. I'm worried about you, I'm worried about the dog.
Over a day later, after multiple unanswered messages, Simon finally resurfaced on Andy's doorstep. He looked exhausted, but Andy was ready for some answers.
I was pretty angry, and he was like, wait, back off a little bit. I can't handle being yelled at. I've had a horrible few days. And I said, look, I don't like you going silent like this. It kind of makes me panic.
Simon was very apologetic when Andy told him that he needed to communicate better. And, of course, he promised he would do so.
Simon Reed appeared to be a man of his word. But sometimes promises are impossible to keep.
I had no idea where he was. I didn't know what had happened. I just felt completely used.
We all had our own suspicions that something wasn't quite right.
By the summer of 2008, Andy Nash was once again consoling her boyfriend of 2 months, Simon Reed. Simon's latest emergency was an injured dog that had caused him not to return any of Andy's messages for almost 2 days.
He did seem to be genuinely sorry. He stayed over for a little bit, and he ended up having to leave early in the morning. He seemed to be really in a hurry.
But as dusk settled into night, Simon Reed was once again nowhere to be found.
The next day, I woke up, looked at my phone, no messages, no texts, and I thought, something definitely isn't right this time.
I was worried about him that something had happened, but given his track record, it just seemed really sketchy at that point.
When another day came and went without a peep from Simon, Andy's worry turned to anger.
I figured out I didn't know Simon Reed at all. I didn't know where he really lived. I didn't know a lot of things about him.
Andy wasn't sure what to think, until a day later, when she got an answer she never expected.
My cell phone rang. There was a woman on the phone, and she said, "Is this Andy? Is Simon with you?" And I said, "No, I don't know where he is. I've been looking for him. Do you know anything?" And she said, no, I'm actually looking for him too. I'm Simon's wife. It was like being punched in the stomach. It was such a blow.
Andy tried to keep her composure as Simon's suspicious behavior suddenly became clear.
His wife said that on 4th of July, when he had supposedly fallen off a building, she and Simon had actually gone out of town to see some of her relatives that day.
Simon's wife also informed Andy that no drunk driver had ever crashed into their home, nor had their dog been involved in any sort of accident. It seemed that Andy's boyfriend was nothing more than a charming liar.
Andy called me crying, and I was in complete shock. I just kept thinking, how dare he? What kind of person does that to someone else?
All of a sudden, with one phone call, everything was over. It was a big shock to my system.
After a long cry and a big glass of wine, Andy decided the best way to get closure with Simon Reed was where their relationship started, online.
I'd had a blog going for quite a few years, so I took to my blog and I put up a picture of Simon and I said, this is Simon Reed, this is what he's done, just watch out for him. And it was very cathartic.
Andy hoped her blog would help other women wise up to Simon's lies. And just 9 months later, Andy would learn that her actions had indeed paid off.
One day I got a comment that said, my name is Joe, I live in England. I've actually just been done in by Simon Reed.
Also a victim of Simon's tall tales, Joe had come across Andy's blog during an internet search. As the two women exchanged emails, pieces of the Simon Reed puzzle began to fall into place.
He had fled to the UK after ditching me and his wife. And Joe was living in England, had met Simon, and she gave him money to start up his rock climbing business.
I offered him the use of my card, which people may consider foolish, but when you think you're getting married, at some point you share money and you share bank accounts, and that's what I thought we were doing.
But before Joe knew it, Simon had disappeared and taken around $26,000 of her money with him.
It was almost kind of a relief to have, oh, I'm not the only one that this happened to.
Both Joe and Andy wondered how many other women could be out there. And they wouldn't have to wait long. Another email was about to set an entire ambush plan in motion.
There was no hesitation for catching Simon.
The last thing he expected was to have these women find each other and come together and pounce.
By the summer of 2010, 2 years after Simon Reed had mysteriously disappeared on his girlfriend, Andy Nash, Andy had good reason to still be thinking about her ex.
I decided to put everything out there on my blog, and I got an interesting email from a woman in England called Jo. She had been swindled out of a lot of cash from Simon.
Joe's email had been shocking, but what came next was the biggest surprise of all.
The next time I heard from anyone, it was roughly about a year later. There was another comment on my blog from someone new named Nicola saying, oh my God, I think I'm dating this guy right now.
I thought Simon was a trustworthy guy until about maybe 3 weeks into our relationship. I started to think that I didn't really know who Simon was, and I decided that I would start to do an internet search. As soon as I put Minnesota and his name into the search engine, he popped up on Sandy's blog.
Since Nicola lived in England with Simon's current information, and Joe had been desperately trying to track him down, Andy introduced the two women over email.
Once Sandy gave me Joe's contact information, we chatted on the phone, and then we made a plan that we would meet up and somehow catch Simon out.
But before the women could begin hatching their plan, another shocking encounter would leave them speechless.
The friend that I'd been with the night I found Simon on the internet, she had spoken to a friend of hers, and her friend said, oh, hold on a minute, I think my friend is dating Simon too.
The woman's name was Laura, and not only was she dating Simon, but she lived right down the street from Nicola. With Joe's consent, Nicola immediately went to talk to Laura.
I took my camera and I said to her, I'll just show you a picture of me and Simon. And she just looked at the picture and she said, yeah, that's my Simon.
Nicola asked Laura if she would like to be involved in their plan to unmask Simon.
Laura was straight away, yeah, I want to be in on it. How could you do this to me?
The women knew that action was key if they wanted to catch the elusive Simon. That same night, their plan took shape.
We hatched a plan to meet Simon at Laura's house because she was due to see him the following night.
Nicola then arranged for a journalist friend to videotape the entire confrontation.
I was kind of wishing that I could be there too. It sounded very dramatic and exciting.
On August 5th, 2010, the women gathered at Laura's house in nervous anticipation of Simon's arrival.
My son sat in the car outside with the mobile and was warning us when he walked up the street.
Simon came in, I think he generally just let himself in, and she greeted him, you know, with a normal kiss and, how's your day, darling? And she asked him to go through and put the kettle on.
But as Simon came through the kitchen door, he got the surprise of his life.
As he saw me, he just stopped in his tracks and just said, oh, hello.
Hello.
And then the cameraman said, is there anyone else that we should know about? And Simon said no. And then he heard footsteps behind him and he turned around to see Joe.
You could see his heart beating quite a lot through his T-shirt. And I think really he just looked really pathetic. I paid £350 for your gym membership. I gave you 1,400 quid out of my credit card. I can't go on a holiday this year because I don't have any money.
As the women grilled Simon for the next 2 hours, the man who had once seemed impossible to pin down was now surprisingly stagnant.
He'd never once asked to leave in all that time. Simon said that he basically didn't know why he does the things that he does.
You're saying sorry to any of you, so that's stupid.
No, because you're not sorry.
I don't really know what the truth is from you.
Couldn't give us any answers. I suppose you want to think that you were the special one out of everybody there, that he must have loved you a little bit more than them, but he didn't.
He tries to keep us all happy by telling us things that we want to hear, knowing that he can't fulfill any of the things that he tells you he's going to do.
Other than being a liar, Simon claimed he was an innocent man.
Simon actually asked after the 2 hours for the police to be called.
I think at that point, are the police coming?
I think Simon was willing to turn himself in because possibly all of his lies had come out.
I don't go into it on people.
You do.
I don't.
And I think probably at that point, he didn't think he'd actually done anything legally wrong.
But Simon Reed was wrong. The video evidence showed him confessing to borrowing money from Joe with the promise to pay her back from investments he never really had. Police immediately arrested Simon and charged him with fraud.
I think that justice was served, but to be honest, it won't stop him from doing it again.
In November of 2010, Simon Reed was arraigned in Plymouth, England on fraud by deception charges. And in March of 2011, he was sentenced to 30 months in jail. Thousands of miles away, Andy Nash felt a sense of closure.
I feel that it's a just punishment. I can say that I hope he learns a lesson from it, but I don't really know if that's possible.
If you do love, don't do the stuff you do.
I don't think I know what love is.
Today, Andy Nash has moved well beyond Simon Reed.
I've learned from this experience, if someone seems too good to be true, they probably are.
More importantly, Andy didn't allow her experience with Simon to sour her search for a life partner.
I'm with a man now he's wonderful, he's charming, he's nice, but most importantly, he's not married.
Across the pond, Simon's other ladies have also moved forward.
I fought the credit card company. In the end, I probably lost about £5,000, so that's not as bad as 17,000, which is what it was.
I think the good things that came out of this, karma can catch up with anyone, so be careful.
The city was already awake when the call came in, the kind of gray New York morning where sirens blended into the background like a second language, where no one stopped walking just because something terrible had happened. But on the corner of East 116th Street, time did stop. A delivery driver found the door ajar. A smell he couldn't place. A silence that felt wrong. Inside, the apartment looked untouched at first glance, no broken windows, no overturned furniture, no blood screaming for attention. And yet, someone was missing. In 1989 New York, that was enough to make the room feel cold. This would become a cold case before anyone was ready to call it that. The missing woman was 27, a name already fading from memory by the time detectives wrote it into their notebooks. She worked late shifts, paid rent on time, kept her life compact. Friends described her as careful, private, the kind of person who didn't make enemies because she barely made noise. Her building was ordinary, 5 stories, narrow stairs, neighbors who nodded but didn't ask questions. The kind of place where people vanished quietly. When police stepped inside her apartment, the clock on the microwave was still blinking, frozen at 2:14 a.m., as if the room itself had tried to record the moment something went wrong. There were no signs of struggle. Her purse sat on the kitchen table. Her coat was still hanging by the door. The bed was unmade, but that meant nothing. In New York, chaos was not proof of crime. Calm could be more disturbing. Outside, the street kept moving. Buses hissed. Vendors shouted. No one noticed the police tape until it was already there. Detectives canvassed the building floor by floor, knocking on doors that opened just enough for eyes to peer out. One neighbor claimed to hear footsteps late at night. Another thought they heard voices. Someone else mentioned a man they'd seen once, maybe twice, hanging around the entrance. Descriptions conflicted. Timelines collapsed under pressure. Memory bent itself to fit fear. The city swallowed details whole. By afternoon, the phrase, missing under suspicious circumstances, appeared in internal reports. By evening, it was already competing with half a dozen other crises. In 1989, New York didn't slow down for one missing woman. It barely slowed down for the dead. Her last confirmed sighting came from a coworker who remembered her leaving work just after midnight, stepping into the cold with a tired smile, saying she'd take the subway home like always. The station camera footage was grainy, faces smudged into ghosts. She appeared once, briefly, walking past a turnstile. Then she vanished into the underground river of the city. No clear exit. No clear companion. Just motion dissolving into darkness. The investigation pushed forward anyway, driven by routine more than optimism. Detectives checked hospitals, shelters, morgues. They traced phone calls, bank withdrawals, transit cards. Nothing moved. No activity. No body. No note. Her absence became louder than any evidence they could find. Within days, whispers began. A secret boyfriend. A stalker. A voluntary disappearance. Every theory found a voice. None found proof. Her family arrived from out of state, stunned by the scale of the city and the speed with which attention evaporated. They sat in precinct waiting rooms under fluorescent lights, answering the same questions again and again. Did she have enemies? Did she use drugs? Did she talk about leaving? Each answer was no, and each no seemed to frustrate the process further. In New York, simple lives didn't fit the narrative of violent crime. Then came the first strange detail. A neighbor mentioned seeing the apartment door open early that morning, hours before the delivery driver arrived. At the time, no one thought to report it. In that building, doors opened and closed constantly. But when detectives pressed for details, the timeline shifted. The door might have been open longer than first assumed. Someone might have been inside. Or someone might have left. That possibility cracked the case open just enough to let doubt rush in. Forensic teams re-examined the apartment. Fingerprints were partial, overlapping, old. Hair samples told no story. The bathroom drain was clean. Too clean, one detective thought, but not clean enough to prove anything. There was no blood, no clear trace of violence, no physical anchor to hold the investigation in place. The city had erased the scene simply by continuing to exist. As days turned into weeks, the case file thickened with paper, but not with answers. Tips poured in at first, sightings in Brooklyn, rumors in Queens, a call from someone who claimed to recognize her on a late-night bus. Each lead collapsed under scrutiny. Each hope faded quietly, without apology. The phrase cold case was never spoken out loud at first. Not officially. But the detectives felt it creeping in. You could hear it in the way calls were returned slower, in the way new cases took priority, in the way the board on the wall stopped changing. Her photo remained pinned there, edges curling slightly, eyes frozen in a moment before everything disappeared. Years passed. The city changed its face. Buildings were renovated. Streets were renamed. The subway stations got new tiles, new lights. But the file stayed the same. A woman vanished in 1989. No witnesses willing to stand behind their statements. No suspects who could be charged. No remains to bury. Occasionally, the case resurfaced. An anniversary article. A true crime segment late at night. Each time, the same words were used: baffling, mysterious, unsolved. Each time, detectives revisited old notes, listening for something they might have missed. Each time, they came back empty-handed. One retired investigator would later say the case never felt finished. Not because of what they knew, but because of what they didn't. There was no explosion, no clear act of brutality. Just a clean break, like someone had reached into her life and removed her without leaving fingerprints on the world. That kind of disappearance haunted him more than any murder scene. In the neighborhood, stories mutated. Some said she'd been taken by someone she trusted. Others insisted she'd stumbled into the wrong place at the wrong time. A few claimed she was still alive, living under a different name, watching from a distance. The truth, whatever it was, never surfaced. It stayed buried beneath speculation, beneath time, beneath the noise of a city that didn't pause long enough to listen. By the late 1990s, the case was officially dormant. Cold. Filed away. The evidence sealed, the questions unanswered. New detectives read the summary and shook their heads. Too many gaps. Too little to work with. A missing person swallowed by New York at its most unforgiving moment. And yet, the apartment on East 116th Street never quite lost its weight. Tenants came and went. Some claimed the place felt strange. Others reported nothing at all. Life continued, indifferent. But for those who knew the story, the silence inside those walls felt deliberate, as if the room itself was holding onto a secret it refused to release. This was not a case of chaos. It was a case of absence. No screams. No headlines that lasted more than a day. Just a woman who stepped into the city and never stepped back out. A cold case born not from violence, but from vanishing. And somewhere in the layers of New York, beneath concrete, beneath memory, beneath time, the truth remained, waiting, unmoved by years of questions, untouched by the passage of everything else. The file did not go cold all at once. It cooled gradually, like a body left out in winter, heat escaping so slowly no one noticed the exact moment it was gone. In the months after the disappearance, detectives kept returning to the same questions, circling them like vultures over an empty street. Who knew her routine? Who knew she lived alone? Who would have had the confidence to walk into that apartment without forcing a door? Every answer pointed not outward, but inward, toward the small, quiet orbit of her daily life. They started with the people closest to her, because that's where disappearances usually hid. Coworkers were brought in, one by one, their stories overlapping, but never aligning perfectly. She was quiet. She kept to herself. She sometimes mentioned being tired. Someone recalled her saying she felt watched, but couldn't remember when or by whom. Another insisted she never said anything like that at all. Memory under pressure became unreliable currency. Her phone records revealed nothing dramatic. No long, obsessive calls. No threats. No sudden breakups captured in numbers. Just routine. A life that moved in predictable lines. And yet, someone had stepped into that routine and erased it. One name surfaced early and refused to disappear. A man who lived 2 floors below her. He was older, recently divorced, known to linger in the hallway longer than necessary. A neighbor remembered seeing them speak once, maybe twice. Polite conversation. Nothing overt. But in a case with no blood, no weapon, no witnesses, politeness became suspicious by default. Detectives knocked on his door with questions sharpened by frustration. He answered calmly. He remembered her. Barely. Said hello in passing. Nothing more. He had an alibi for the night she vanished home alone, watching television. In 1989, an alibi like that was both common and impossible to disprove. His apartment showed no signs of struggle, no hidden evidence. He agreed to fingerprinting, to interviews, to everything asked of him. And when nothing surfaced, his name slid quietly back into the file, unresolved but uncharged. The investigation widened. Bars she sometimes visited. Stores along her walk home. The subway station again and again, its tiled walls and endless staircases offering no answers. Detectives stared at the same blurry footage until faces lost meaning, until every shadow looked like a man following too close behind. They traced the exits she might have taken, mapped the routes she might have walked. Each path ended in speculation. Then came the anonymous call. It arrived late one evening, crackling through the line, the voice low and careful. The caller claimed to have seen her that night, not at the station, but near her building. Claimed she wasn't alone. Claimed she looked uncomfortable. When detectives pressed for details, the voice retreated, offering fragments instead of facts. A tall figure. Dark clothing. A pause before answering questions. The call ended abruptly, leaving behind a single sentence that stuck in the room long after the line went dead. She didn't want to go with him. It was the closest thing to a breakthrough they'd had in weeks, and it was still nothing they could touch. No caller ID. No way to trace the voice. No corroboration. Just another ghost added to the growing population of the case. Pressure from above mounted quietly. Resources were finite. Homicides with bodies demanded attention. Disappearances without evidence slipped down the priority list. Detectives felt it in the reassigned hours, in the cases pulled from their desks. The missing woman from East 116th Street became a name mentioned less frequently, a file opened only when time allowed. Her family refused to let it fade. They put up posters long after the city had stopped looking at them. They called precincts, newsrooms, anyone who would listen. Each call reopened wounds, but they made them anyway. Silence felt worse than pain. On anniversaries, they returned to the city, standing on sidewalks crowded with strangers who had no idea what had been lost there. Years layered over the case like dust. Technology advanced. Old evidence sat waiting for tools that didn't yet exist. A partial fingerprint that couldn't be matched. A hair without a root. Items logged, sealed, forgotten. When the department finally digitized its records, her file was scanned and uploaded, its mysteries flattened into data. Every few years, a new detective would stumble across it, drawn in by the lack of resolution. Fresh eyes, same questions. They'd call old witnesses, only to find numbers disconnected, people moved, memories eroded. One neighbor had died. Another couldn't remember her face. Time had done what a killer often hopes for. It blurred everything. A theory emerged quietly among those who revisited the case, never written down, never officially endorsed. The idea that she knew the person who took her. That she opened the door willingly. That there was no scream because there was no immediate fear. It explained the lack of forced entry. It explained the absence of chaos. It did not explain where she went. Some believed she never left the building alive. Others argued she was taken somewhere else, somewhere that swallowed evidence whole. Construction sites. Abandoned properties. Places New York hid its dead during the worst years. Without a body, every location was both possible and impossible. The city itself became a suspect. In the late 80s, it was loud, crowded, dangerous in ways people barely registered anymore. Crimes bled into one another. A missing woman could vanish between headlines, overshadowed by louder horrors. Her case wasn't unique in its tragedy, only in its silence. By the time the new millennium arrived, the file had been reopened and closed more times than anyone could count. Each reopening carried a spark of hope, each closure another quiet defeat. Detectives learned not to promise answers they couldn't deliver. The phrase, "we're still looking," became a shield against expectation. In the neighborhood, few remembered her name anymore. The building had new tenants, new locks, new paint. The apartment where she lived was remodeled, its walls stripped of any trace of who had once been there. Life moved forward, efficient and unbothered. But somewhere in the system, her case remained unresolved, a question mark that refused to straighten itself into a line. The cold case unit eventually took it on, decades too late to make miracles likely. They laid the evidence out again, this time under brighter lights. They ran what they could through new databases. They searched for patterns across similar disappearances, hoping to find repetition where there had once been randomness. What they found instead was isolation. Her case didn't fit cleanly with others. It stood alone, stubborn and opaque. One investigator described it as listening to a recording with the volume turned down too low. You knew there was something there, but no matter how hard you strained, the words never became clear. The truth was present, somewhere, but unreachable. And so the case remained suspended between moments. Not active. Not forgotten. A missing woman from 1989, still missing, still unresolved. A cold case defined not by what happened, but by what never surfaced. No confession. No remains. No closure. Just a city that kept moving and a silence that grew heavier with every year it was left unbroken. The problem with time is not just that it passes, but that it edits. It deletes details without asking permission, trims away certainty until only the broad strokes remain. By the early 2000s, the case had entered that phase where facts were no longer solid objects, but impressions, shapes remembered through fog. Detectives reopening the file could feel it immediately. Statements contradicted one another. Notes referenced conversations no one could recall having. The past had begun to argue with itself. What hadn't changed was the emptiness at the center of it all. No body. No crime scene you could point to and say, this is where it happened. Just an apartment that had once belonged to someone who never came back. In homicide investigations, the dead speak through evidence. In disappearances like this, silence did all the talking. One investigator, newly assigned to the cold case unit, noticed something others had overlooked, not a clue, but a pattern of absence. Every lead stopped short of the same point, the moment she reached her building. Before that, there were witnesses, cameras, routine. After that, nothing. No confirmed sighting beyond the entrance. No one remembered seeing her go upstairs. No one remembered seeing her leave again. It was as if the building itself had closed around her. That observation pulled the focus inward once more. They re-interviewed former tenants who could still be found. Some were reluctant, others eager, as if finally being asked again validated their lingering unease. One woman remembered hearing an argument that night, muffled through walls, voices low but sharp. She hadn't called the police. In 1989, people learned not to. Another recalled footsteps on the stairs at an odd hour, heavier than usual, followed by a door closing too quietly. She hadn't thought it mattered at the time. Individually, the details meant nothing. Together, they suggested proximity. Whatever happened, happened close. Uncomfortably close. The building's maintenance records were pulled from storage. Repairs. Lock changes. Complaints. One entry stood out, a work order filed weeks after the disappearance, requesting a repair to a storage area in the basement. A broken latch. The work had been done quickly, with no further notes. The storage units themselves had been reassigned years ago. Contents cleared, moved, discarded. Whatever had once been there was gone. Investigators visited the basement anyway. It smelled like dust and old concrete, the kind of place where sound died quickly. They stood there, imagining scenarios, knowing imagination was not evidence. The problem with cold cases wasn't a lack of theories. It was the abundance of them. Another name resurfaced, this time from outside the building. A man she'd dated briefly months before disappearing. Not serious. According to friends, it ended quietly. According to him, it barely happened at all. He lived across town, had his own life, his own alibi. But something about the way he minimized the relationship caught attention. People often exaggerated connections. Erasing them took effort. They spoke to him again. He was older now, slower to answer questions, irritation replacing the defensiveness of earlier interviews. He insisted he had nothing to do with it. Said he barely remembered her. Said he'd moved on. His timeline was vague, but not contradictory. No physical evidence tied him to the apartment, the building, the night in question. Once again, suspicion found no anchor. As the case deepened without advancing, the emotional weight shifted. It stopped being about solving a mystery and became about acknowledging a failure. An entire system had looked at a disappearance and found nothing to hold on to. That kind of failure lingered. The family felt it most. Decades had passed, but grief did not obey calendars. They learned to live with unanswered questions, but they never accepted them. Every phone call from the police reignited hope and dread in equal measure. Every new investigator promised nothing, because promises had already been broken by time itself. Media interest flared occasionally, usually when some unrelated case reminded the city of its unresolved past. A headline here, a segment there. Each retelling polished the story, smoothing rough edges, simplifying what had once been complex. The missing woman became a symbol rather than a person. Her life reduced to a single moment when it stopped. Behind the scenes, detectives wrestled with something harder than missing evidence, the possibility that the truth was mundane. Not a serial killer. Not a conspiracy. Just one person, one decision, one moment that slipped between the cracks. Those were the cases that hurt the most. Because they suggested that resolution was not dramatic, it was just late. A forensic review was ordered. Old evidence brought back into the light. Technology had evolved enough to offer hope, or at least the illusion of it. Samples were retested. Databases expanded. For weeks, the lab hummed with quiet anticipation. Then the results came back. Inconclusive. Degraded. Unusable. Time had claimed its share. Still, something shifted during that review. A technician noted trace material on an item logged from the apartment, something so minor it had never been prioritized. At the time, it meant nothing. Now, it meant maybe. Not enough to identify anyone. Not enough to charge. But enough to suggest another presence, another set of hands. Someone had been there. The finding wasn't publicized. It couldn't be. But inside the unit, it changed the tone. The case wasn't empty anymore. It was just quiet. Investigators returned to the anonymous call from years earlier, replaying the recording, studying the cadence of the voice. Linguists listened for regional patterns. Analysts searched for similar calls tied to other cases. Nothing definitive emerged, but the call gained new weight. If someone had seen her that night, if she had indeed been with someone she didn't want to be with, then the disappearance was not voluntary. It was interrupted. Interrupted lives often left ripples. They searched again for any unusual behavior in the days following her disappearance. A neighbor who moved out suddenly. A tenant who stopped showing up for work. A man who changed routines, habits, addresses. One name flickered briefly, then faded when records failed to support suspicion. It was always like that. A spark, then darkness. The city outside the precinct windows looked different now. Safer, cleaner, quieter in ways no one in 1989 would have believed possible. But the past didn't adjust itself to the present. The disappearance remained rooted in a harsher era, one where vanishing was easier, where noise covered sins. One night, long after official hours, a detective stood alone in the evidence room, staring at the sealed boxes. He knew the chances. He knew most cold cases stayed cold for a reason. But he also knew that the truth, once hidden, didn't stop existing. It waited. Sometimes for decades. Sometimes forever. He closed the file gently, as if it might bruise. Outside, New York kept breathing. Millions of lives overlapping, colliding, disappearing into one another every day. Somewhere within that mass, a story remained unfinished. A woman who stepped inside her building and never stepped out again. A moment suspended, refusing to resolve itself. The case did not end. It did not begin again. It hovered, caught between memory and forgetting, held in place by the stubborn refusal to declare it impossible. Because as long as no answer existed, neither did closure. And in that unresolved space, the cold case lived on, quiet, heavy, and waiting. There was a moment, years after the disappearance, when the case almost broke open, not with a confession or a discovery, but with a mistake. It came quietly, buried in paperwork, the kind of error no one noticed until long after it mattered. A property log from 1989 listed an item taken from the apartment and later returned to evidence storage, but the date didn't align with the rest of the record. It was off by days, maybe weeks. At first glance, it looked like clerical noise. On a second look, it suggested something else. The apartment may have been accessed after it was supposedly sealed. That possibility sent a ripple through the unit. They traced the chain of custody back through retired officers, archived logs, handwritten notes yellowed by time. The trail was incomplete. One officer remembered being called back to the scene for a follow-up, but couldn't recall why. Another insisted no one entered after the initial search. The truth lay somewhere between certainty and forgetting. But if someone had gone back inside, officially or not, it raised a question no one wanted to answer. What were they looking for? And what might they have missed? The apartment itself was gone in everything but address. Renovated twice since the late 80s, stripped down to brick, rewired, repainted. Any physical trace that might have existed had been erased by progress. The city had rebuilt over the silence, layer by layer, until the past was no longer visible. Only records remained, and records lied as often as they told the truth. Investigators shifted focus again, this time to movement. Not just hers, but everyone else's. Who was in the building that night who shouldn't have been? Delivery logs. Utility work orders. Taxi records from nearby streets. In 1989, data didn't leave digital footprints the way it did now. Much of it was gone. What survived was incomplete, fragile. Still, one detail stood out. A late-night service call logged for a neighboring building, involving a contractor who had access to multiple properties on the block. The name meant nothing at first. It was common work. Routine. But the timing overlapped. The address was close. Too close to ignore. They tracked him down years later, living in another state, older, slower, less guarded. He remembered the neighborhood. Remembered the work. Didn't remember her. Said he'd never been inside that building. Said he'd never crossed paths with her. His answers were flat, rehearsed, or simply distant. There was no evidence tying him to the apartment. No witness. No physical trace. Another potential path closed itself without ceremony. As the years stacked higher, the case began to exert a strange pull on those assigned to it. Detectives found themselves thinking about it off the clock, replaying scenes that had no footage, imagining conversations no one could confirm. It wasn't obsession. It was unfinished business. The mind's refusal to leave an empty space empty. The family aged alongside the file. Parents grew frail. Siblings took over the burden of asking questions. Each generation learned the same vocabulary, ongoing, under review, no new developments. They learned to read tone instead of words. Hope learned to disguise itself as patience. In one interview, decades after the fact, a family member said something that stayed with the investigators. If she had died, we could have buried her, they said. This is worse. This is like she's still knocking somewhere, and we just can't hear her. The sentence hung in the room long after the interview ended, heavier than any evidence. The cold case unit revisited similar disappearances from the same era, hoping for overlap. Women who vanished near home. Apartments with no forced entry. Lives interrupted without witnesses. Patterns emerged briefly, then dissolved under scrutiny. Each case had its own gravity, pulling theories inward, refusing to align cleanly with others. If there was a connection, it was buried deep. One theory gained quiet traction among investigators, never formalized, never announced. The idea that the disappearance was not planned long in advance, that it was impulsive, an encounter that escalated, a moment where control slipped. These were the hardest cases to solve because they left the least behind. No preparation meant no trail. No witnesses meant no pressure. Just aftermath managed in silence. They returned again to the question of access. Who could enter her apartment without forcing their way in? Who knew her schedule well enough to approach her at the right moment? Friends were ruled out. Coworkers offered nothing new. The building residents had mostly scattered to other boroughs, other states, other lives. The pool of suspects had thinned to shadows. At one point, a detective suggested something that felt almost heretical. That the truth might already be in the file, mislabeled, misread, dismissed too quickly in the chaos of the original investigation. A detail considered irrelevant at the time, now carrying weight. They combed through reports again, slower this time, less confident in past conclusions. They found inconsistencies. Small ones. A time written differently in two places. A statement summarized rather than quoted. A question never followed up. None of it proved anything. But together, it painted a picture of an investigation overwhelmed by its era, stretched thin, forced to move on before it was ready. Outside the precinct, the city told a different story. New York marketed itself as reborn, its dark years reframed as history rather than warning. Crime statistics dropped. Neighborhoods transformed. But unresolved cases didn't care about narratives. They sat outside them, immune to optimism. Late one night, an investigator pulled the original missing person flyer from the file. The photo was grainy, the paper fragile. A young woman stared back, caught mid-expression, unaware of the future pressing in. The detective wondered what she would have become. What life had been interrupted. The question had no investigative value. It still mattered. The case pressed on, not forward but inward, collapsing under the weight of its own unanswered questions. Each year without resolution made the truth harder to reach, but also harder to ignore. Because somewhere between what was known and what was lost, something real had happened. Something final. And as long as no answer surfaced, the disappearance remained active in the only way that mattered. Not on paper, but in the minds of those who refused to let silence stand in for truth. By the time the case crossed its 20th year, it had acquired a kind of gravity that younger investigations did not. New detectives approached it with caution, aware they were stepping into something layered with past failures and unresolved hopes. The file was thick, but its weight came not from evidence, rather from the years pressing down on it. Every page represented a moment when the truth might have surfaced and didn't. A decision was made to reconstruct the night from scratch, not by following the original timeline, but by questioning it. Investigators began with the assumption that something fundamental had been wrong from the start. That the sequence of events everyone accepted might be incomplete or, worse, incorrect. They focused on the hours after midnight, the stretch of time where her movements dissolved into uncertainty. The subway footage showed her entering the station, but not exiting. That gap had always been explained away as technical limitation. Cameras failed. Angles missed things. But what if she hadn't taken the subway home at all? What if she left the station with someone? Or what if she never made it onto the train in the first place? Witness statements from the station were re-examined. A transit worker recalled seeing a woman who matched her description speaking to a man near the platform. He hadn't thought it suspicious. People talked. That was New York. But he remembered the way she stood, slightly turned away, arms close to her body. A posture that suggested hesitation. The memory was vague, decades old, but it fit uncomfortably well with the anonymous caller's claim. If she left the station with someone, then the disappearance shifted locations. It no longer belonged solely to her building. It belonged to the spaces between. The sidewalks. The stairwells. The moments where no one was watching closely enough. Investigators mapped the walk from the station to her apartment again, this time with a different eye. They marked blind spots, poorly lit areas, entrances that could conceal someone waiting. In 1989, street lighting was inconsistent. Whole blocks fell into shadow after midnight. The city offered cover to anyone who knew how to use it. One alley, less than a block from her building, drew attention. It connected to a service entrance shared by multiple properties. Rarely used. Poorly maintained. A place where sound didn't travel far. There were no reports tied to it. No witnesses. That, in itself, made it interesting. The absence of attention could be its own clue. They looked for anyone associated with that service entrance. Sanitation workers. Maintenance crews. Night security. Most records were gone. Names lost to time. What remained were patterns, rotating shifts, temporary hires, people who passed through and left no trace behind. The kind of people who could be present one night and gone the next. Another theory emerged quietly alongside the others. That the disappearance wasn't a single event, but a sequence. An encounter near the station. A conversation. A decision made under pressure. The apartment door opening later, not to welcome her home, but to stage something. To create normalcy where there was none. It would explain the untouched interior. The coat still hanging. The purse left behind. A life paused, then carefully set back in place. This idea disturbed investigators more than most. It suggested intent. Not long-term planning, but awareness. Someone who understood that absence could be hidden by order. That chaos drew attention, but calm delayed it. They searched again for anyone who benefited from delay. Anyone whose schedule aligned with the hours between her last sighting and the discovery of the open door. A neighbor who worked nights. A local business owner who closed late. A building employee with keys. Each name was examined, then set aside when proof refused to appear. The emotional toll of the case deepened as theories multiplied without resolution. Detectives learned to temper hope, to treat every new idea as provisional, fragile. Cold cases taught restraint. Excitement often led nowhere. The family, meanwhile, lived in two timelines at once. The present, where birthdays passed quietly, and the past, frozen at the moment she vanished. They marked time not in years, but in questions. What if she had taken a different route? What if someone had walked her home? What if someone had listened more closely? On one anniversary, a small vigil was held outside the building. Candles flickered against brick walls that had witnessed nothing and everything. Neighbors passed by, some pausing, others hurrying past. For a brief moment, the city acknowledged the absence it had absorbed decades earlier. Then the candles burned down, and the street returned to its rhythm. Within the department, the case developed a reputation. Not notorious. Not famous. Just stubborn. The kind of file that resisted closure without theatrics. No villain to unmask. No revelation to deliver. Just a space where answers should have been. One senior detective described it as a negative image. "We're not missing clues," he said. "We're missing the moment they should have appeared." That observation reframed everything. The failure wasn't in what investigators didn't find. It was in what never had a chance to exist. As the case approached 3 decades unresolved, a final push was authorized. Not because anyone believed it would solve the disappearance, but because leaving it untouched felt wrong. They reopened tip lines. Released age-progressed images. Asked the public to remember. Most responses were noise. Some were cruel. A few were sincere but unhelpful. Still, one call stood out. A woman claimed to have known someone who talked about a girl who disappeared in Harlem back in the 80s. The man was dead now, she said. Died years earlier. He'd never given names. Never offered details. Just fragments, delivered when he drank too much. She couldn't be sure it meant anything. She almost hadn't called. Investigators wrote it down anyway. Another fragment. Another maybe. The case did not move forward. But it shifted. The idea that the truth might be held by someone who would never speak it aloud settled in like a permanent chill. A cold case not because of neglect, but because of finality. Because the one person who could explain it might already be gone. And so the disappearance remained suspended, balanced between theories and silence, resisting every attempt to pull it into focus. A life interrupted. A city that kept moving. And a question that refused to age, waiting patiently in the dark spaces where answers should have been. As the case edged closer to 30 years unresolved, something subtle changed inside the department. It was no longer treated as a problem to be solved, but as a presence to be managed. A reminder. New recruits learned about it the way sailors learn about a wreck hidden just below the surface, marked on charts, rarely seen, never forgotten. It shaped how people thought about disappearance, about how easily a person could be erased without violence ever announcing itself. The cold case unit began working backward from a different premise. Not who took her, but who noticed she was gone and who didn't. The timeline between her last confirmed sighting and the discovery of the open door became the narrow window where everything had to fit. Someone had time. Someone had privacy. Someone had confidence that no one would interrupt. That kind of confidence didn't come from nowhere. They examined patterns of behavior in the building during that period. Late-night activity logs. Noise complaints. Calls to management. One detail resurfaced that had been dismissed years earlier, a tenant who frequently complained about people coming and going at odd hours. At the time, it was written off as paranoia. Now, it read like awareness. Someone paying attention. The tenant was tracked down in a nursing facility, memory softened by age but not entirely gone. When asked about the night of the disappearance, they hesitated. Said they remembered hearing a door close late. Said it sounded deliberate. Not rushed. Not angry. Just final. They couldn't say which door. Couldn't say what time exactly. But they remembered lying awake afterward, feeling unsettled. That feeling, unsettled, appeared again and again in old statements. Neighbors who hadn't seen anything, but felt something. A change in the air. A quiet that lingered longer than it should have. None of it was admissible. All of it was human. Investigators returned to the idea that the crime may not have been loud or chaotic. That it might have unfolded in calm tones, behind closed doors, disguised as normal interaction. Those were the hardest acts to detect. They blended too well. Another avenue opened briefly when a long-forgotten report surfaced from a nearby precinct. An unrelated disturbance call logged the same night, only blocks away. A woman arguing with a man on the sidewalk. No names taken. No follow-up. In 1989, calls like that were constant. But the timing aligned. The description was vague. Too vague to confirm anything. Still, it planted another image into the growing mental collage of that night. What if she never made it home at all? This possibility forced investigators to reconsider the apartment itself. The open door. The untouched interior. Those details had anchored the case for decades. But anchors could mislead. What if the apartment was a decoy, unintentionally or otherwise? What if the assumption that the disappearance centered there had narrowed the search too early? Yet every time they tried to let go of the apartment, the facts pulled them back. Her belongings. Her coat. Her keys. All there. All waiting. Whatever happened, it ended or was made to look like it ended inside those walls. The emotional strain on investigators deepened in ways they rarely admitted. Cold cases were supposed to be analytical, detached. This one refused to stay that way. It crept into conversations, into late nights, into moments of doubt. Some detectives confessed privately that they dreamed about it, not the crime itself, but the moment just before. The unknown instant where everything changed. The family continued to age. One parent passed away without answers. Another followed years later. The responsibility of remembering shifted again, carried by those who had been children when she disappeared. For them, the case wasn't just a mystery. It was inheritance. A question handed down without consent. Public interest flickered and faded as it always had. Podcasts mentioned it briefly. Blogs speculated without substance. Each retelling added noise, but not clarity. The case resisted storytelling. It had no satisfying arc, no twist waiting at the end. Just a long, unresolved middle. Inside the department, there was quiet debate about whether the truth, if it surfaced, would even matter anymore. Would a name, decades late, bring justice? Would it bring peace? Or would it simply confirm what everyone already feared, that the answer had been close all along, hidden by ordinary human failure? One detective, nearing retirement, spent his final months reviewing the file alone. No committees. No meetings. Just hours with the paper trail, letting it speak in its own fractured way. He marked passages, circled times, wrote notes in the margins. Not because he believed he would solve it, but because he didn't want to leave it untouched. On his last day, he closed the folder and placed it back in storage. He didn't say goodbye to it. Some things felt wrong to end that way. The case endured, not as an active investigation, but as a question suspended in the city's memory. A woman who disappeared without violence, without witnesses, without resolution. A cold case defined by restraint rather than brutality, by silence rather than sound. And in that silence, something unsettling remained. The sense that the truth was not dramatic, not cinematic, just close enough to have been missed, just quiet enough to survive. After the retirement of the last detective who had carried the case from the 90s into the new century, something unexpected happened. The file stopped moving entirely. No reassignments. No fresh reviews. No quiet reopening disguised as routine. It sat untouched, not because it was forgotten, but because no one felt qualified to disturb it. The people who knew its weight were gone. What remained was a record without a voice. That absence created its own tension. Years later, a junior analyst stumbled onto the case while digitizing legacy files. She wasn't assigned to it. She wasn't even looking for it. But something about the lack of resolution caught her attention. No body. No suspect. No ending. In a system built to close loops, this one remained open in a way that felt almost intentional. She flagged it for review, not expecting much to come of it. What followed was not a breakthrough, but a reorientation. With distance from the original investigation, the analyst approached the case without inherited assumptions. She didn't feel loyalty to the apartment as the center of gravity. She didn't feel constrained by earlier theories. She read the reports the way one reads a foreign language, slowly, carefully, aware that meaning often hides in structure rather than content. One thing stood out immediately. The language changed after the first 48 hours. Early reports were precise, urgent. Later ones grew cautious, hedged. Words like confirmed gave way to believed. Observed became reported. The shift marked the moment when certainty slipped out of reach. That moment mattered. She mapped the case not by events, but by confidence. Where investigators were sure. Where they weren't. The largest gap sat squarely between the subway station and the apartment door. Everything before was documented. Everything after was assumed. That assumption, she believed, had hardened into fact without ever being proven. She brought her observations to a supervisor who had never worked the case. Together, they re-examined the evidence with fresh indifference to legacy. Not disrespect. Indifference. A willingness to say, what if this was wrong? They returned again to the open door. In the original report, the time of discovery was listed as early morning. But the exact moment the door was first noticed remained unclear. The delivery driver saw it open. A neighbor may have seen it earlier. Another might have seen it later. No one could agree. That uncertainty created a window wide enough to drive a narrative through. What if the door had been opened long after she disappeared? The idea reframed everything. If the apartment had been sealed when she vanished, then the untouched interior meant nothing. It wasn't evidence of calm. It was evidence of absence. Someone else could have opened the door later, intentionally or accidentally, without ever knowing what they were revealing. The analyst traced building access logs again, this time focusing on keys. Not who had them, but how many existed. Original tenants. Management. Maintenance. Contractors. Emergency spares. Over years, keys multiplied. Control diluted. In 1989, key tracking was informal at best. Anyone with access could come and go unnoticed. The analyst also noticed something else. In the early interviews, one neighbor mentioned hearing water running late at night. It was dismissed. Plumbing was old. Sounds traveled. But the note stayed in the file unexplained. Water ran where? For how long? No one followed up. That detail lingered. She asked a simple question no one had asked before. If someone wanted to remove evidence without drawing attention, what would they use? Not fire. Not chemicals. Something ordinary. Something expected. Water. There was no proof. No residue. No forensic trail left after decades of renovation. Just the possibility that the absence of evidence was not accidental. That someone had cleaned not to erase violence, but to erase presence. The theory never made it into an official report. It couldn't. It was built on gaps, on maybes, on what-ifs. But it changed how the case was understood by those who now looked at it. It was no longer about a missing woman alone. It was about timing. About access. About how long it takes for certainty to dissolve into assumption. The analyst also found something else, small, easily overlooked. A notation that one of the original responding officers had requested a replacement uniform shortly after the initial search. No explanation given. No report filed. It could have meant nothing. Could have been routine. Or it could have been a detail too ordinary to question at the time. She didn't accuse. She didn't speculate publicly. But the idea that institutional blind spots might have shaped the case became harder to ignore. Not corruption. Not conspiracy. Just human systems failing quietly. When the analyst presented her findings, the response was muted. Interesting, they said. Worth noting. But not actionable. Without new evidence, the case could not move. It could only be reinterpreted. And reinterpretation did not bring closure. Still, something had shifted again. The case was no longer frozen in its original shape. It had become fluid, uncertain, open to revision. That flexibility, paradoxically, made it heavier. Because it suggested the truth might never have been dramatic enough to stand out. It might have blended in, passed through unnoticed, lived quietly among procedures and routines. The disappearance now felt less like a singular event and more like a failure of alignment. A moment when attention, timing, and awareness missed each other by seconds. Enough for a life to slip through. Outside, the city continued its endless renovation of memory. New buildings replaced old ones. Streets changed names. Faces changed generations. The disappearance from 1989 receded further into abstraction, known only to those who chose to remember. But inside the file, the questions sharpened rather than dulled. Not who did it. Not where she went. But how easily it happened. How little resistance the world offered when someone vanished quietly. And that realization brought with it a colder thought. If it could happen once, unnoticed, it could happen again. The first thing that happens when a cold case wakes up is not noise, not sirens, not an arrest splashed across the front page. It's paperwork. It's a file pulled from a shelf so long untouched that the cardboard edges feel soft, like they've been handled by time more than by human hands. It's a detective reading the same lines written decades earlier and realizing the words don't describe a person anymore, they describe a gap. A missing shape in the city. A hole that everything else learned to step around. And then, quietly, the gap starts to speak again. Not with answers. With questions that suddenly feel sharper than they used to. Because now the case isn't fighting the chaos of 1989. It's fighting the calm of distance, the false comfort that comes from assuming the past is finished just because the calendar moved on. In the cold case unit, the file lands on a desk beside newer crimes, louder crimes, cases with bodies and photographs and evidence that can be held up to the light. This one offers none of that. This one offers absence. And absence, when you stare at it long enough, becomes its own kind of evidence. The analyst's notes don't accuse anyone. They don't point to a suspect. They don't claim a conspiracy. But they do something more dangerous. They suggest the case might have been shaped by a series of small, ordinary decisions. The kind that never make headlines. The kind that don't feel like mistakes until they become permanent. A supervisor asks for a limited internal review. Not a full reopening, not a public announcement, just a check. A cold case audit. The phrase sounds sterile, almost polite, but inside the department it has a bite. Because it means revisiting old actions, old assumptions, old names. It means asking, in plain language, what exactly did we know then, and what did we simply decide to believe? The original responding officers are mostly retired now. Some are dead. Others have moved away, living quiet lives far from the city they once patrolled. The review team tracks down who they can. Phone calls are made with careful voices. Messages left. Conversations held in living rooms where grandchildren's toys sit on the floor, where the smell of coffee replaces the smell of precinct corridors. The officers remember the era more than the details. They remember exhaustion, overcrowded radios, the sense of being outnumbered by the city's problems. When asked about the missing woman, most pause longer than expected, as if trying to lift a memory that's been buried under decades of other scenes. Some remember her face on the flyer. Some remember the building. Some remember nothing at all and are ashamed to say it. One retired officer insists the apartment was searched thoroughly, that no one entered after it was sealed. Another admits he can't swear to that. He says things were hectic. That it's possible someone went back inside to retrieve something. That it wouldn't have been unusual. That in those days, procedures were guidelines more than laws, especially when cases didn't scream for attention. That sentence, "didn't scream for attention," hangs in the air like a confession no one intended to make. The review team returns to the chain of custody error that started this shift. They trace it carefully, step by step, and find what they feared, a blank spot. Not proof of tampering, not proof of corruption. Just a gap where documentation should have been. A missing line in a logbook. A date without a signature. A handoff that exists in memory but not on paper. That gap is not evidence of guilt. But it is evidence of vulnerability. It means the case was exposed to time, to human error, to the possibility that something important was moved, touched, cleaned, or returned without anyone realizing the cost. In a different kind of case, one with blood, one with a weapon, this would be scandal. In this case, it's just another shadow. Another place where certainty collapses. They bring in a modern forensic consultant, someone who wasn't alive when the city looked the way it did in 1989. She listens without nostalgia, without reverence. She studies the file like a puzzle with missing pieces and asks a question that makes the room go still. What are you actually trying to prove happened? Because even now, decades later, no one can say it cleanly. Was it a kidnapping? A murder? A voluntary disappearance? An accident? A cover-up? The file contains theories, but theories are not a narrative you can test. You can't run evidence against smoke. So the consultant reframes it brutally. There are only a few core possibilities. She returned home and disappeared from inside the building. She never returned home, and the apartment details misled everyone. Or she returned home with someone else, and what happened next was contained, quiet, erased. Each path demands different evidence. Each path collapses at different points. And the case, stubbornly, sits at the intersection of all three. Then comes the second strange detail, the water. The old note about running water is re-examined with new attention. No one can confirm it. No one can locate the exact apartment where the sound was heard. No one can prove how long it lasted. But the consultant knows something the original investigators might not have treated as significant. In crimes without visible violence, cleaning is not an afterthought. It is the act. It is the method of disappearance. It is how absence is manufactured. Still, there is no physical trace left to test. Renovations have eaten the scene. Plumbing replaced. Floors stripped. Drains new. The building has been remade into something the past can't cling to. All that remains is a concept that someone might have tried to wash away their presence. Not because there was blood, but because there were fingerprints, fibers, hair, skin cells. The tiny, invisible signatures that people leave everywhere without thinking. And that idea invites an even colder thought. Whoever did this, if someone did this, understood something about how investigations work. Or at least understood what not to do. No forced entry. No chaos. No dramatic moment that would force neighbors to call police. Just a quiet removal. A careful exit. The kind of thing that becomes a mysterious missing instead of a homicide. Cold case, the consultant says, not as a label but as a diagnosis. Because the crime itself was designed to cool. The review team wants to push further, but the file pushes back. Every attempt to turn possibility into proof hits the same wall. Time. People forget. People die. Records disappear. The city itself changes so completely that you can't even stand where you need to stand to feel what the night might have felt like. 1989 is not accessible anymore. It exists only as an atmosphere inside old reports. So they do the only thing left. They look outward. They ask whether anyone from that building was later involved in violence, whether any resident was arrested in subsequent years, whether any name on the tenant list appears in later cases. The search yields hits, but not clarity. Small arrests, domestic disputes, a robbery, a man picked up for assault years later in another borough, a woman involved in fraud, a few lives with rough edges, but nothing that ties directly, nothing that screams here. Here is your answer. In a cold case, you learn that the absence of a connection can be its own warning, that the person responsible might never have offended again, or might have offended in ways no one linked, or might have died before patterns formed. The case doesn't tell you which. It simply refuses to connect. Publicly, none of this is known. The family is informed in careful language that the case has been reviewed, that some records are being re-examined, that they are still committed. The family hears commitment the way drowning people hear air, desperately. They ask if there's anything new. The answer is no, nothing actionable. No lead that can be pursued without turning into a fishing expedition. No evidence that can be taken to court. No suspect to name, even privately. And yet, the family senses something they've felt before, the shift in tone. The subtle change from passive sadness to uneasy interest. The feeling that something might be wrong in a new way. They go back to their own memories. To the last phone call. The last holiday. The last time she laughed. They replay conversations, searching for hidden meaning. Did she mention someone? Did she sound afraid? Did she act distracted? They hate themselves for it because it turns love into interrogation. But grief makes investigators out of everyone. The cold case unit decides to revisit the neighborhood, not for evidence, but for atmosphere. They walk the street in daylight. They stand by the entrance. They listen to the building breathe. The city is cleaner now, more expensive, less forgiving in a different way. But when you look at the brickwork, at the narrow stairwell, at the basement door tucked out of sight, you can still feel it, the way a person could disappear here without causing a spectacle. The way the building's geometry creates blind corners. The way sound dies quickly behind old walls. One detective looks up at the windows and imagines what a neighbor might have seen if they'd looked out at exactly the right moment. A figure guiding another figure. A small struggle mistaken for lovers arguing. A woman pulled close, her discomfort invisible from the street. The detective hates that his mind goes there, but it keeps going because that is what cold cases do. They force you to build pictures from fog. And then, as if the case itself resents being stared at too long, it produces another whisper, another headline-sized phrase with no proof behind it. A former tenant, contacted during the review, mentions an old rumor. Not a fact. A rumor. That years after the disappearance, someone in the building claimed to know what happened. Claimed it was an accident. Claimed it got handled. The tenant never heard it firsthand. Heard it from someone who heard it from someone else. The kind of rumor that spreads because it is terrifying and vague at the same time. An accident. That word detonates inside the unit because it fits the silence too well. Accidents don't require planning. Accidents require response. Cover up. Panic. Containment. If something happened inside those walls that wasn't intended, an argument that turned physical, a fall, a moment of violence that wasn't premeditated, then the calm interior makes sense. The lack of forced entry makes sense. The missing body makes sense in the ugliest way. Not because the person responsible was brilliant, but because they had time, access, and a city loud enough to hide in. Still, it is only a rumor. And rumors, without names, are just another layer of fog. The case remains unresolved. But it feels different now. Not warmer, not closer to closure. Just more unsettling. Because the review has exposed something the family has always suspected. The disappearance didn't have to be cinematic to be final. It didn't have to be a serial killer stalking the streets. It could have been something quieter, closer, more ordinary. A door closing. Water running. A decision made in a hallway when no one was listening. And that thought leaves the city with a new kind of chill. Not the chill of a monster in the shadows. The chill of knowing the shadow could have been a familiar face. The rumor didn't arrive like a confession. It arrived the way most cold case breaks arrive, half-formed, second-hand, wrapped in nervous laughter and disclaimers. I don't know if it matters. I'm probably wasting your time. It was a long time ago. But the word that slipped through the cracks, accident, hit the unit like a flashbulb in a dark room, not because it solved anything, but because it changed what the case felt like. Monsters are easier. Monsters make noise. Accidents are quieter. Accidents demand decisions. Quick ones. Ugly ones. Decisions made in hallways and basements and stairwells when the city is sleeping and no one is watching and your whole life is about to split open. The detectives didn't celebrate. They didn't even smile. They just did what cold cases force you to do, pull the thread even if you know it might be attached to nothing. They tracked the rumor back as far as it would go. Tenant A heard it from Tenant B. Tenant B heard it from a cousin of Tenant C. Tenant C, supposedly, heard it from a guy who used to hang around the building, the kind of vague phantom every old neighborhood produces. Names were missing. Dates were soft. But the rumor had one consistent shape. Someone inside that building claimed to know what happened, and the story wasn't about a predator in the streets. It was about something that went wrong behind a door. That shape narrowed the search in a way the case hadn't been narrowed in decades. The unit dug up old tenant rosters, if roster was even the right word for what existed in 1989. Paper slips. Handwritten ledgers. Management notes. A cluster of surnames repeated across years, suggesting long-term residents, people who didn't just pass through. Those names were the only fixed points left in the building's history. They started calling. Some numbers were dead. Some voices answered and went quiet when they heard why the police were calling. Some people laughed and said they didn't remember anything, and the laughter sounded like a door closing. Others insisted they'd never forget it, but they'd never known anything either. The case had become a ghost story in its own neighborhood. Everyone felt its presence. No one could describe its face. One former tenant agreed to meet, not in her apartment, not in the precinct, but in a diner with a wide window and too much light. She was in her 60s now. She stirred her coffee without drinking it. She said she'd been young then, living with a roommate, working nights. She said the building had rules that weren't written down. Keep your head down. Don't ask. Don't stare too long in the hallway. Don't get involved. Then she said something that made the detective's pen stop moving. After she disappeared, the woman said, someone told me it was handled. Handled. A word that belonged to maintenance, not missing people. A word that sounded like trash removal, not tragedy. The woman hated herself for repeating it. She hadn't believed it then. She still didn't know what it meant now. But she remembered who said it. A man in the building, someone she'd seen around, someone who spoke like he knew more than he should. When detectives asked for his name, she hesitated, then gave it carefully, as if the syllables were sharp. The name was already in the file. Not as a suspect. Not as a person of interest. Just as a resident mentioned in passing, a neighbor who'd been interviewed and dismissed because there was nothing concrete. The kind of name that lived in cold cases like a pebble in a shoe, too small to stop you, too irritating to forget. The unit pulled every reference to him. Old statements. Old notes. The alibi, home alone, watching television. The calm cooperation. The willingness to fingerprint. The absence of evidence. It was all familiar. Nothing had changed. And yet the word handled made it feel different, like the same photo viewed under a harsher light. They needed something solid. Something that could survive scrutiny. Because rumors were wind, and wind couldn't open a case on its own. They ran him through every modern database they had. Arrest records. Court filings. Address histories. Employment. Associates. The results were disappointing in the way cold cases always are, messy, incomplete, normal. A few minor incidents. Nothing that screamed violence. No homicide charges. No smoking gun. If anything, the lack of a clear trail made the rumor more frustrating. A monster would have left a pattern. A quiet man could leave nothing. Then another odd detail surfaced. A small one. The kind that makes detectives stare at the ceiling for a long moment because they can't decide if it's meaningless or the beginning of something. The man had moved out of the building within a year of the disappearance. Not immediately. Not overnight. But sooner than expected for someone described as stable, settled, long-term. He had relocated to another borough, then another state. Nothing criminal. Nothing dramatic. Just movement. Life. People move every day in New York. Still, in a case built from absence, movement looked like a footprint. The detectives reached out to the state where he'd last been recorded. He was alive, according to public records, but hard to contact. No listed phone. No clear employer. A quiet exit from visibility. It might have been nothing. It might have been everything. When they finally found a number connected to a relative and requested an interview, the response came back sharp and defensive. He doesn't want to talk. He's old. Leave him alone. The unit pressed gently, officially. The relative refused. No subpoena was possible. There was no probable cause. No new evidence. Just a rumor and a word. And yet, that refusal landed like a strange clue of its own, not proof, not guilt, but friction. People who have nothing to hide still sometimes hide. People who are innocent still fear police. The unit reminded itself of that. Cold cases feed on confirmation bias. They didn't want to become the kind of investigators who shaped facts to fit a narrative. So they moved sideways. If the rumor was true, if something had been handled, then someone else might have known. Someone might have helped. People rarely carry heavy secrets alone for decades unless they have to. They looked for associates, friends, roommates, family, anyone with ties back to that building in 1989. A cousin who lived nearby. A friend who visited often. A girlfriend who stayed over. Names came up. Most were dead ends. But one was not. A man who'd been arrested years later for an unrelated offense had mentioned that building in an old interview. Not the missing woman. Not the disappearance. Just the building, spoken of as a place where things happened. The comment was too vague to matter at the time. Now, it stood out like a flare. Detectives requested the old audio. It took weeks to locate. When they finally listened, the man's voice was younger, cocky, thick with the swagger of someone trying to sound untouchable. He mentioned the building as a place you didn't mess around in, because people disappear and nobody asks. He laughed when he said it. Then he changed the subject. It wasn't evidence. It was atmosphere. But atmosphere was all this case had ever offered. The unit arranged to interview him again, now older, incarcerated, tired. When the detectives mentioned the building, his eyes flickered. Not fear. Not guilt. Recognition. That recognition was enough to make the room feel colder. He denied knowing anything specific. Then he admitted he'd heard rumors. Then he admitted everyone had heard rumors. When pressed, he said the same word the tenant had said without being prompted, handled. He shrugged like it was nothing. That's what people said, he murmured. Back then, nobody wanted trouble. The detectives leaned in. They asked who said it. He gave a name that did not appear in the file. Someone who had worked maintenance in the building, according to him, someone with keys and access and reason to be in the basement at odd hours. A man whose job was to fix things, move things, clean things. And suddenly the case snapped into a new, terrible logic. Maintenance meant keys. Keys meant entry without force. Maintenance meant the basement. The storage area with the broken latch. The work order filed weeks after the disappearance. The running water. The possibility of cleaning. It didn't prove anything, but it aligned, and alignment in a cold case felt like thunder. They searched for the maintenance worker's name. It was common. Too common. Records were thin. Companies had dissolved. Contracts had changed hands. But after days of digging, they found a match. Someone who had worked for a subcontractor servicing multiple buildings in the area in 1989. Someone who lived in the city then and moved away later. The trail led to a retirement community far from New York. The man was alive, but fragile. The unit debated ethics, pressure, timing. Cold cases are not just puzzles, they're people. They decided to try anyway, gently. They requested an interview through local authorities. The response came back: he had memory issues. He was not lucid consistently. He could not be questioned in any meaningful way. Another door closed. In a cold case, doors don't slam. They just fail to open. And every failed opening leaves you with the same thing you started with: absence. The unit returned to New York with the rumor still lodged in their hands like grit. They had names now. Threads. A possible structure. But still no evidence that could survive a courtroom. No confession that could survive scrutiny. No body that could anchor the story to reality. They were building a bridge from shadows and hoping it would hold. And the worst part was the way it made the case feel more human, not less. If this was an accident, then the disappearance wasn't the work of a mythic killer. It was the work of panic, of fear, of decisions made to protect oneself, or protect someone else, or protect the illusion of normal life. That kind of evil doesn't announce itself. It sits at the kitchen table. It walks the hallway. It nods politely when you pass. The family was told only what they could be told. That the case had new avenues. That new interviews were being attempted. That certain names were being re-examined. They asked the question they always asked, the one that never got easier: are you closer? The detective didn't lie. He said, "We know more about what we don't know." It sounded like nothing. It was everything. Because for the first time in decades, the case had a shape that didn't feel like pure fog. A building. Keys. A basement. A rumor. A word. A possible chain of people who might have carried a secret across time like a weight in their chest. Still, the truth remained just out of reach, close enough to haunt, too far to prove. And in the quiet after the interviews, after the paperwork, after the long drive back from dead ends, one thought settled over the unit like a headline written in cold ink: the city didn't have to kill you loudly to erase you. Sometimes all it took was a door closing at the wrong moment, and the right people deciding to handle the rest. The case didn't warm up the way movies promise. It didn't ignite into flashing lights and sudden confessions. It warmed like a fingertip pressed against glass, just enough to leave a print, not enough to melt anything. The cold case unit now carried something it hadn't carried in years, a direction that felt plausible. Not proven. Not clean. But plausible. Keys. Access. The basement. A rumor repeated by people who didn't know each other well enough to coordinate a lie. A single word that kept surfacing like a buoy in black water: handled. In New York, that word could mean anything. It could mean nothing. That was the danger. They returned to the building again, not as tourists of grief, but as engineers of possibility. The geometry mattered. The stairwell angles. The sight lines from windows. The basement door that wasn't visible from the street unless you knew where to look. The service entrance shared with neighboring properties, the alley that cut sound in half. The cold case unit walked it slowly, counting steps, noting corners, imagining the kind of movement that wouldn't draw attention. In 1989, the building had been dimmer, louder in a different way, full of late-night arguments and radios and footsteps. Back then, a muted struggle could be mistaken for lovers. A firm grip could look like familiarity. A woman pulled close could look like a couple avoiding the cold. No witness statement would ever say that. But the city's indifference did. The unit needed something, anything, that could be tested. Rumors weren't testable. Memory wasn't testable. Atmosphere wasn't testable. Evidence was. And evidence, after 30-plus years, was mostly gone. Renovations had erased surfaces. Tenants had replaced tenants. The basement storage units had been reassigned, emptied, rebuilt. If something had been hidden there, it was long gone unless, by some strange mercy, it wasn't. There was one category of evidence that sometimes survived time: paper. Not the polished kind. The ugly kind. Invoices. Work orders. Contractor logs. Payment receipts. The administrative debris of a building's life. Most people don't realize how much paper trails cling to property management until someone tries to disappear inside them. They subpoenaed what they could. Some companies no longer existed. Some records were lost in moves and mergers. But a few boxes surfaced from a storage facility in Queens, labeled in fading marker with a property management name that had changed twice since 1989. Inside were brittle folders, cracked plastic sleeves, stale air. The past, boxed and forgotten. The detective who opened the first folder felt that familiar pulse of hope, dangerous hope, the kind that makes you see patterns where none exist. He forced himself to slow down. Page by page, month by month. He looked for anything tied to the basement, anything tied to locks, to repairs, to water, to cleaning, to removals. And there it was again, a work order for a latch repair, logged weeks after the disappearance. The same one they'd seen before. But this time, alongside it, was a short note written in the margin in a different pen. Extra keys issued. Extra keys issued. No names. No explanation. No signature. In a normal case, it was nothing. In this case, it was oxygen. They tried to trace who issued them and to whom. The management office from that era was gone. The superintendent had died. His family didn't have records. But the work order referenced a subcontractor company, and that company, against all odds, still had an archived employee list on microfilm. The unit requested it. When the film arrived, the names blurred under the reader's light like ghosts lined up for inspection. They found the maintenance worker's name again. The same one the incarcerated man had mentioned. This time, the file included a partial address from 1989 and an emergency contact. That contact, an older sister, was deceased, but her children were not. The unit tracked them down carefully, not as suspects, not as targets, but as possible owners of old context. Families keep secrets in the form of stories. Sometimes those stories don't feel like secrets until someone asks the right question. The niece who answered the phone sounded wary before the detective even finished his introduction. The name New York did that to people. It made them brace for trouble. The detective asked about her uncle, about his work in the late 80s, about whether he ever mentioned certain buildings. She said he didn't talk much about work. Then she paused. Then she said something almost too small to register. He used to come home exhausted, she said. Sometimes he'd wash his hands over and over. My mom thought he was just stressed. The detective wrote it down and hated himself for the way his mind immediately jumped to meaning. Hand-washing could mean guilt. It could mean cleanliness. It could mean nothing. He asked if her uncle ever mentioned an incident, a problem, a night that stayed with him. The niece hesitated again. Hesitation was not evidence. But it was a crack. There was a time, she said, when he stopped taking certain jobs. He said he didn't like that neighborhood anymore. The detective asked which neighborhood. She didn't know. She said it was uptown, near Harlem, somewhere like that. It was vague, but vagueness was the currency of old family memories. Still, it aligned too well to ignore. When the detective asked if her uncle was alive, she said yes, but not well. She said he was in assisted living. She said he wasn't himself most days. The unit already knew that. But hearing it from family gave it weight. The door to direct questioning was closing before it ever opened. They debated again, ethics, legality, purpose. A man with memory issues cannot be used as a tool. A family cannot be pushed to satisfy institutional curiosity. And yet, the family of the missing woman had been pushed by silence for decades. The scales were uneven. They were always uneven in cases like this. The unit decided to try a gentle, local welfare interview with medical oversight, not an interrogation, not a trap. Just an attempt to see if any coherent memory existed at all. The day the local officer visited the assisted living facility, the cold case unit waited like people waiting for storm news. The report came back short. The man had been polite. Confused. He recognized his own name. He did not recognize 1989. He did not recognize the building address. When asked about extra keys, he stared blankly. When asked about New York, he smiled faintly and said that was a long time ago. No denial. No confirmation. Just time swallowing the question whole. The unit pivoted again, because that was what cold cases demanded. If the man couldn't talk, maybe his life could. They requested his employment records. They requested his tax filings. They tried to map his work sites, his routes, his patterns. The map that emerged was frustratingly ordinary. Multiple buildings, multiple neighborhoods, the kind of routine that scattered a person's presence everywhere without anchoring them anywhere. But then, hidden among the addresses, there was one repeated point, the block near the missing woman's building. Not just once. Several times over a year. It didn't prove he was there that night. It proved he had access. It proved he knew the layout. It proved he could move through those basements like a person moving through their own kitchen. And access, in this case, felt like power. The unit presented these findings to prosecutors, carefully, without dramatics. Prosecutors listened the way prosecutors do, seeking what can stand, not what can haunt. They asked the inevitable question, do you have anything physical? The unit did not. They asked, do you have a witness who heard a confession firsthand? The unit did not. They asked, do you have remains? The unit did not. The prosecutor's voice softened slightly when he said it. Then you have a story, he said, not a case. Stories didn't convict. Stories didn't bring closure. Stories could also ruin innocent people if told too loudly without proof. The unit understood that. They felt the weight of it. They felt the temptation to chase narrative simply because narrative was comforting. Comfort was dangerous. Still, the work had changed something in the building's shadow. The unit could now describe a plausible mechanism for disappearance, access without force, movement without witnesses, a basement route that avoided street-level attention. In a city as loud as 1989 New York, that mechanism might have been enough. The family was briefed again, with even more careful language. They were told that the investigation had identified individuals who had access to the building in that era. They were told records were being reviewed. They were told no arrests were imminent. The family asked again, are you closer? The detective answered with something he hated because it sounded like a cliché. We're seeing the shape of it, he said. But we still can't touch it. After the call, the detective sat alone for a long time, staring at the wall, feeling the way the case pressed on him like a hand. He thought about the word accident again. The ugliness of it. Not because accidents are harmless, but because accidents imply a moment when the truth could have been confronted and wasn't. A moment when someone chose concealment over confession. A moment when the city's noise made that choice easier. He thought about the door. The open door. Whether it had been open that morning because someone forgot to close it, or because someone wanted it found, or because someone wanted the narrative to begin at the wrong time. In cold cases, misdirection doesn't have to be genius. It only has to be early. He thought about the running water. Whether it was real, whether it was imagined, whether it was a sound that meant nothing until someone needed it to mean something. The mind clings to detail because detail is all it has. And then, in the middle of that quiet, another possibility surfaced, one that felt like a knife under the ribs. What if the case was never about one person? What if handled wasn't a singular act, but a shared understanding? A building culture. A small network of people who knew how to make trouble disappear because they'd done it before in smaller ways, unpaid rent, unwanted tenants, problems in the basement, a man sleeping in the stairwell, a fight that ended with someone leaving and never coming back. Not murder. Not always. Just removal. Quiet solutions. The kind that get normalized when institutions are overwhelmed and neighborhoods learn to survive. If that was true, then the missing woman's disappearance wasn't just a crime. It was a symptom. A moment when a city's worst habits crystallized into one irreversible silence. The detective stood, turned off the light in his office, and left the precinct late. Outside, New York in the present was lit cleanly, polished by decades of change. People moved quickly. The street looked safe. Ordinary. But the detective could still feel 1989 under the pavement like a buried layer of ice. And he understood, with a clarity that felt almost cruel, that the case might never be solved not because the truth was unreachable, but because the truth had been reachable once, and time had already closed its fist around the moment anyone could have forced it into the light. There is a moment in every cold case when the room goes quiet and you can feel the investigation breathing, slow, shallow, stubborn, because everyone inside that room understands the same thing at the same time. You have reached the edge of what the past will give you. You can push, you can pry, you can beg time for one more detail, one more name, one more mistake someone made in 1989 that survived into the present like a fingerprint in dust. But eventually the file looks back at you with blank eyes and reminds you that silence is not the same as innocence, and absence is not the same as peace. The cold case unit tried anyway. They asked for one last search, not of streets or subway footage or the apartment that no longer existed, but of what remained consistent, concrete, pipes, the stubborn bones of the building that had outlived everyone's memory. They wanted access to the basement storage area, not because they believed a miracle was hiding down there after decades of renovations, but because the rumor had tightened around that place like a noose. Keys. Extra keys issued. Running water. A broken latch. The word handled. A maintenance worker who moved through basements the way other men moved through living rooms. A resident who left within a year and never wanted to talk again. A building culture that taught people not to get involved. To search the basement properly, they needed permission and paperwork and the kind of legal justification cold cases rarely offer. The building's current management hesitated, cautious about liability and headlines, cautious about the idea that their property might become a crime scene in the imagination of the public. Detectives explained the request in careful language, stripped of drama. They didn't say murder. They said missing person. They didn't say rumor. They said re-examination of legacy evidence. They didn't say, we think something happened here. They said, we need to rule out possibilities. Even then, bureaucracy moved like winter. Weeks passed. Then months. The unit kept working other cases that bled loudly enough to demand attention, but the missing woman from 1989 stayed on the edge of every conversation. A door half open in the mind. When the approval finally came through, limited access, narrow scope, supervised entry, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like permission to touch a ghost. They entered the basement on a morning that was too bright for what they were doing. Fluorescent lights buzzed, casting a clinical glow over concrete stained by decades of use. The smell was the same smell every old basement carries: dust, moisture, metal, something sour that never quite leaves. Pipes ran along the ceiling like exposed veins. The detective leading the search walked slowly, listening to his own footsteps, imagining the sound of footsteps from 1989, heavier, purposeful, followed by a door closing too quietly. They photographed everything, because that's what you do when you have nothing else. They measured spaces, because measurement gives the illusion of control. They noted access points, because access was the only thing the case had ever offered. Behind one set of storage units, they found evidence of older construction, patches of concrete that didn't match the rest, repairs layered over repairs, the building's own history written in uneven textures. No bones. No hidden compartment. No dramatic discovery. Just more structure, more silence, more proof that time had remodeled the past into something smooth enough to live on top of. A detective knelt near a drain, the kind of drain people never notice until they need it, and stared at it until it blurred. In his mind, he heard water running again, not as a sound someone confirmed, but as a sound the case had taught him to imagine. Water as ordinary cover. Water as ritual. Water as an attempt to wash away the smallest traces of a presence that should never have been there. He stood up slowly, feeling ridiculous, feeling furious, feeling the way cold cases make grown people want to punch walls because the truth is not obligated to show itself. They left the basement with bags of dust and fragments and nothing that could anchor a prosecution. The forensic lab would test what it could, not because anyone believed it would change everything, but because you don't stop just because your faith is tired. In cold cases, effort becomes a form of respect. It is the only apology the system knows how to give. The results came back the way they always came back. Inconclusive. Contaminated by decades of traffic. Not attributable. Not admissible. Not enough. The detective didn't slam his fist on the desk. He didn't curse. He just stared at the report until the words stopped looking like words and started looking like a verdict the universe had written in a language no court could translate. They returned to the people again, because evidence had failed and people were all that remained. The family, now smaller than it had been, arrived at the precinct carrying the same grief in older bodies. Faces changed by time, voices worn down by years of unanswered questions. The detective sat across from them with a folder that felt heavier than it should have, and the room felt suddenly too quiet for a city like New York. He told them what he could tell them. That the case had been reviewed. That new avenues had been explored. That certain names had been revisited. That access issues had been re-examined. That the building's basement had been evaluated within legal limits. He did not say the words that would turn rumor into accusation. He did not say the names that could not be supported by proof. He did not offer closure like a cheap product. The family listened with a kind of discipline that only long grief teaches. They didn't interrupt. They didn't beg. They didn't cry immediately. They just waited, as if they'd learned that emotion sometimes makes officials retreat. When the detective finished, one of them asked a question that landed like a blade. "Do you think she suffered?" The detective swallowed. In his mind, he saw the calm apartment, the coat on the hook, the purse on the table, the absence that screamed louder than blood. He remembered the word accident and the way it suggested suddenness, not ritual. He remembered the way the case had always felt quiet, too quiet for prolonged horror. He chose his answer carefully, not as a storyteller, but as a human being refusing to add cruelty to a family's nightmare. "I don't know," he said softly. "But I don't think she had time to understand what was happening." It was not a promise. It was not a fact. It was an attempt to keep the darkness from becoming needlessly graphic. The family nodded as if the nod itself was a form of survival. They had lived this long without certainty. They would live longer with careful guesses. Then they asked the question that never stopped being asked, no matter how many decades passed. "Is it over?" The detective looked down at the file. The file did not contain an ending. It contained a life interrupted and a system that never found the place where the interruption happened. It contained names that might matter and might not. It contained a rumor that repeated itself like a prayer spoken by people afraid to say more. It contained the word handled in handwriting that had survived longer than the certainty it pretended to record. "It's not over," he said. "It's just quiet." Quiet. The family understood quiet. Quiet was every holiday with an empty chair. Quiet was every phone call that wasn't her. Quiet was every anniversary where the world kept moving as if nothing was missing. Quiet was the ache of a question that had outlived the people who first asked it. When the meeting ended, they stood slowly, each movement deliberate, like leaving the precinct meant leaving her behind again. One of them turned back at the door and said something the detective never forgot. "Just don't let her become a box." A box. Evidence boxes. File boxes. Storage boxes. The way the system reduced lives into cardboard and labels and shelf numbers. The detective nodded, feeling shame that didn't belong to him personally, but still belonged to the badge, to the institution, to the city. After they left, the detective sat alone and listened to the precinct's sounds, the distant phones, the clatter of keyboards, the hum of fluorescent lights. New cases came in. New victims. New families. New grief. The machine kept moving. It always did. And the missing woman from 1989 remained a gap the machine never managed to fill. That night, the detective walked the block near the building again, not because he expected a clue to rise from the pavement, but because cold cases do something to you. They make you return to the scene as if presence alone could summon truth. The street had changed, but the bones of it were still there. The angles. The corners. The way an alley could swallow sound. The way a door could close and be mistaken for nothing. The way a city could witness everything and remember nothing. He stopped near the entrance and looked up at the windows. People lived there now who had never heard her name, who had never touched that decade, who had never felt the chill of a case that refused to resolve. Their lights glowed warmly. Their curtains moved. Their lives continued. And that was the final cruelty of it. Not that the city forgot. The city was too big to hold every sorrow in its arms. The cruelty was that forgetting looked exactly like survival. Streets repaved, basements repaired, locks changed, keys reissued, Paperwork filed, time moving on as if the past were simply an older version of the present instead of a separate world where a woman walked into a building and never returned. Somewhere in the dark spaces between those worlds, the truth still existed. Not as a narrative, not as a headline, as a fact, a sequence of actions, a decision, a door, a moment when someone chose to handle what they had done rather than admit it. Maybe it was one person. Maybe it was several. Maybe it was nothing like the unit imagined. Maybe the truth was uglier. Maybe it was smaller. But it was there, unmoved by the years that had tried to bury it. The detective felt the familiar pressure in his chest, the sense that the case wasn't just unsolved, it was unfinished, and unfinished things have a way of lingering in the mind like a sound you can't locate. He imagined her walking home, tired,